Some chess players become legend by learning the various skill sets required to master the craft. Others become legend by mastering the fundamentals. The pawn, the bishop, the knight, the rook. Over the next two videos, we're going to study how these four pieces move and how they attack. Class is in session. What up, nerds? I'm Terrence B, and this is Better at Chess. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing the pawn, the bishop, the knight, and the rook. If you're new to the channel, be sure to click the subscribe button below, also like or dislike the video, and also leave a comment telling me what your general thoughts were. Also, if you would like to receive notifications when I release new material, be sure to click the bell icon below as well. Okay, let's do this. First, let's talk about chess sets. I want to address a few things that I didn't talk about in my last video. First thing to note here is that in my last video, I didn't use the traditional chessboard. I used a variation of chessboard here using chess.com. On this board, this is the tournament style pieces, which are typically white at the bottom, black at the top, and a tournament style board, which is typically white and a green variation. There is also there's also this style, which is you might find with the wooden style of boards. There is also, you may see red out there. Red is pretty common as well. If you have the opportunity to get a glass board, which I have had once before in my life, and I've had that board for several years, the glass board is actually pretty nice. Now, the glass board would typically be clear and white. This is more of a bluish and clear. You may see this style as well, which is more of like an off-white and blue. So there are many different styles to the chessboard. It depends on what you want to purchase online. But today, for this video, we're going to stick to what is traditionally used, which is this tournament style pieces as well as the tournament style board. Here at the bottom, we have white's pieces. Here at the top, we have black's pieces. An important note is that white's queen will always sit on the lighter of the two colors on the board. In this case, it's what looks like white and green are the two colors of the board, so white's pieces would be sitting on the white or whatever color this is, the lighter color on the board. Black's queen is going to sit on a darker color. In this case, it's green. Let's begin. So let's clear the board of everything except the pawns. So the pawns are a very unique piece. The pawns essentially have their own sets of rules. And as we learn about the pawns, you kind of see that the pawns really do operate differently than other pieces on the board. For instance, on a pawn's first move, they have the option to move up to 1 or 2 squares. For this pawn, we're going to move up 2 squares. For this one right here, we'll just move up 1. However, once you move that piece, if you notice here, it only has the option to move up 1 square after that. Same thing with this piece. This piece doesn't get the option to move up 2 squares because it's not its first move. It can only move up 1 square. So note, after the pawn moves its first move, it moves 1 square. On the first move, the pawn has the option to move up 2 squares. So that gives players an advantage where they can try to capture the center of the board, which I'll go over in another video, faster. Or just to advance their pawns faster. You want to get your pawns to the other side of the board, which I'll tell you why in a moment. You would want to move your pawns up 2 squares versus moving them up 1. Another thing that makes pawns unique is that pawns are the only piece that moves in one direction and attacks in another. Pawns attack diagonally while moving forward. If this pawn wanted to take this pawn, it would move like this. In this case right here, both pawns are threatening each other, and it depends on whose turn it is what move is played next. White, for instance, can choose to move forward, or I don't know if you can see it there, but there's a little dot there, which means this pawn can take this pawn. Pawns attack diagonally and move forward. In this case, we're going to take this pawn and move it here to take black's pawn. What happens is the pawn takes the other pawn off the board and takes its place on the square. So when this pawn reaches the final row on the board, it has to choose to become a greater piece. So in this instance, we're going to change to a rook. Same thing with this piece right here. When it comes to the first row, but the opposite end of the board, it has to become a greater piece. In this case, we're going to choose a queen. Another move the pawn can perform is called an en passant. An en passant is when your pawn can take a pawn, even though the pawn is not diagonally across from it. That sounds more complicated than it is, so I will demonstrate. In this setup, the white's pawn is on the 5th row. It is exactly 2 squares away from this pawn. If this pawn chooses to jump not 1 but 2 squares here, these 2 pawns are now lined up. On white's very next move, white can choose to take this pawn, even though this pawn is not here. Here is where the pawn would usually need to be for white to be able to take black's pawn. However, in this case, the pawn is here, right next to white's pawn. It chose to jump 2 squares to be directly lined up. Again, on white's very next move, white can take this pawn. Let me show you how. In a regular pawn attack, the pawn would jump there and change places with the pawn. In this pawn attack, the pawn is here, but it's white's move. Now, white can move here and take this pawn. It works the same exact way as a pawn attack. The only difference is it has to be on the very next move. Similar to how the pawn has the option to move 2 squares on its very first move and 1 square after that, if the pawn wants to use an en passant, it has to use it on its very next move, or the move is no longer available. It's a rule that has been around in chess for hundreds of years. Don't know when it was created. I will have to look that up and get back to you guys. However, it is a legal move, and it is a legal move for 1 turn only. To recap, pawns are able to move up to 2 spaces on their first move and 1 space after. Pawns attack diagonally while moving forward. A pawn has a special move called an en passant, where a pawn could take another pawn that is not diagonally lined up across it, but only for the next move. Pawns, once they reach the other side of the board, can be promoted to a greater in value piece. That means it cannot stay a pawn and it cannot become another king. Now we're going to talk about the bishop and the knight.